No News is Good News by B. J. Griffith. Fred Stuckey stared in dismay at the huge flat-screen TV that seemed to have taken over his living room and his life. The 10 o'clock news displayed in blazing high-definition color live coverage of a 4-alarm fire in a neighboring town. The bedraggled tenants of the burning apartment building huddled under blankets like refugees fleeing their homeland. Was the cause arson, faulty wiring, a homemade meth lab? An investigation was underway. Just bad news, no matter what the cause was. Fred grabbed the remote and changed the channel, only to be confronted by an angry woman shouting at the camera that someone had stolen her Virgin Mary statue from her front porch. Click. The next channel revealed a cluster of third-world villagers who were going to go hungry again tonight, waiting for relief after a 5.7 magnitude earthquake had destroyed their homes. Click. Raging rioters brandishing inflammatory banners were stomping through a downtown somewhere. Click. Another high-ranking government official caught in a financial scandal was being led out of his home in handcuffs. Click. The Dow Jones was plummeting. Click. Congress was once again fighting over a proposed bill of some sort. One last click, and Fred extinguished the whole thing. He had had a particularly hard day at work and had been hoping for a little escape, not to be pummeled by bad news from all over the globe. Did he or anyone really need to hear all this? He needed a break. He stood up, ran a hand over his 5 o'clock shadow, and headed for the kitchen for a beer and a look at that morning's newspapers. In the olden days, before Betty had walked out on him, he wouldn't have gotten away with looking at the paper. Again? She would have demanded. You do nothing but look at the news all day long. Now it's evenings too? What about me? Don't I matter? She had a bit of a point there. Fred taught journalism and news editing at the local community college, so he felt it was his duty to keep up with the news. But in addition to subscribing to several major newspapers, he had apps for at least 24 news sites. If he were honest with himself, he'd confess that following the daily news was both his hobby and his passion. Like an addiction, it could get out of control and replace other pastimes that could be more beneficial to him in many ways, not least of all his marriage. In fact, Betty had joked on more than one occasion that if she wanted his attention, she would have to rob a bank and hope to make the front page news. He had to admit he was starting to really miss Betty. He missed her pancakes, the warmth of her as she snuggled up against him in the bed they had shared for nearly 30 years, and the clean linen smell of her perfume. He missed it when she brushed his hair off his forehead, brought him a beer and some homemade snacks, and folded his socks that special way she did. He liked driving her to the stores, seeing her profile in the car, and occasionally playing card games in the evening, sometimes taking walks, holding hands, on a sunny afternoon. Yeah, he even missed massaging her hands while they watched an old movie together on the sofa. He sighed. Here he was, alone in the kitchen. He took a long swig of his beer and even emitted a small, uncharacteristic belch. He picked up the first paper and saw a grainy close-up photo of a young protester shouting at the camera, hatred distorting his features. He picked up the next one and read "Hundreds Missing in Gulf Hurricane" and shuffled it to the bottom of the pile. The last one's headline screamed, "3 Killed in Inner City Shootout," and he put it back down. He just couldn't stomach it tonight. The newspaper was drowning in bad news. One disaster, uprising, scandal, or tragedy after another. What was this world coming to? Of course, this wasn't new. Throughout the course of his life, there had been bad news. But as he had once heard said, it was easier to be in your 20s during the 60s than to be in your 60s during the 20s. Somehow the protests and wars back in those days seemed nobler, more meaningful. Now, with the hundreds of TV stations, news apps, and social media, it seemed as though the selling and spreading of bad news had become a competition to see which source could juice it up the most and include the goriest, most sensational and troubling details. No, not tonight, thanks. Betty was right. Focusing on right here, right now was the right thing to do. Fred gulped down the rest of his beer, rinsed out the can, and put it into the recycle bin along with the newspapers. He headed down the hall, stripped off his work clothes, carefully hung his trousers and tie, and dumped everything else into the washer. Though he was now technically a bachelor, well, only separated, actually, he kept the place tidy the way Betty would have liked it. Then he climbed into the shower and turned the water on so hard that the spray felt like needles. But Fred felt nothing but relief, letting the water wash away all the grim, grimy, grainy, grotesque news stories that had worn him down just when he had most needed a boost. Fred climbed into bed and almost immediately fell asleep. His last thought before Morpheus tiptoed in and took over his mind was, wouldn't it be great if, for just one day, we could have nothing but good news? The next thing Fred knew, his alarm was nudging him to wake up. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, stretched, looked over at Betty, and then remembered she wasn't there. It had been 2 months since she had left for her sisters in Ohio, but he still hadn't gotten used to it. He then slid his feet into his slippers, shuffled to the bathroom, and went through his morning routine. Then, snug in his fleece bathrobe, he headed to the front porch to collect the morning papers. He made himself a cup of coffee and settled in for a good read. Suddenly, the waves of despair he had felt the previous night returned, and he folded his arms across the stack of papers, asking himself if he was up to it today. It didn't take ESP for Fred to predict what he would find in the headlines. More disasters, probes, emergencies, scandals, battles, upheavals, tragedies. He wished Betty were there now in her sweet pastel dressing gown, with the little tangled knot of hair at the back of her head she would get from sleeping, and the fastidious way she arranged herself when she sat down, almost like a cat preparing for a nap. Fred sighed and moved his arms to reveal the top page of his favorite paper, the New York News. He read the headline, sat bolt upright, leaned in, and looked again. It wasn't possible. He looked at the date to make sure it wasn't April Fool's Day. He shook his head and again read the big, bold headline, "Miraculous Recoveries of the World." The page was covered with at least a dozen short articles with intriguing titles. One read, "Accident Victim Recovers Eyesight After Emergency Surgery." Another said, "Recovered DNA Sample Frees Innocent Man from Death Row." Another proclaimed, "Unpublished Novel Recovered from Stolen Briefcase." The astonishing good news went on and on. He flipped to the Washington Press to see more uplifting articles about reconciliations of estranged family members, retrieval of sunken treasure, and rewards for good deeds. Last, the top page of the Wall Street Gazette was headlined, "How to Make Your Life Better Today," with articles on making your own compost, getting a good night's sleep, and improving your mood with music. Still in shock, Fred flipped to the editorial page and saw a personal ad in such huge font that the entire page was covered with this one message: "Fred Stuckey, I miss you too. Let's try to reconcile our differences and make a fresh start. All my love, Betty." Fred leaned forward, plunked his elbows on the table, and dropped his head into his palms. He couldn't believe this morning, this bright, shiny, wonderful morning, and all it seemed to promise. He closed his eyes and squeezed so hard that tears threatened to escape from his soul. A second later, Fred heard a sharp, familiar sound. It was his alarm clock. He opened his eyes and was surprised to find himself back in his lonely bed. When he realized he had just been dreaming, he felt at once disappointed and depressed. Until he remembered something his mother used to say. "Fred, it's your heart that tells you what you want, but it's your brain that tells you how to get it." Resolute and energized, Fred marched into the kitchen, grabbed his phone, and dialed Betty. He didn't expect her to pick up. She wasn't glued to her phone the way he was, or rather the way he used to be. He was simply glad to have a chance to express to her his bottled-up thoughts and feelings in a natural, uninterrupted flow. His ardent appeal worked. Within 72 hours, Betty was back home. The first morning of their reunion, she gingerly stacked Fred's newspapers at his place on the kitchen table and poured his coffee. When he sat down across from her, he moved the papers aside and leaned in, took her hands, looked into her eyes, smiled, and said, "No news is good news, Mrs. Stuckey. I'm so darned happy to have you back where we belong." Thank you. The end.